In 2016, Daniel Webb's farm was earning more profit than it ever had in its history. That part isn't surprising. This part is. He was farming 40 acres. 5 years earlier, he'd farmed 120. He hadn't gotten better equipment. He hadn't found a better market. He hadn't discovered a secret crop. He had simply lost most of his farm in a flood and kept the 40 acres nobody else wanted. The rocky ground, the uneven hillsides, the narrow creek that flooded almost every spring. He kept them because they were all that was left. What happened next is the part that doesn't make sense. Until you understand the question the flood forced him to ask. A question most farmers never think to ask. A question most people never think to ask. Which part of what I'm doing is actually working? And which part am I just maintaining because it's always been there? Daniel Webb grew up in eastern Tennessee, where farms were handed down the same way family recipes were. Nobody asked whether you wanted to farm. If your father farmed, you farmed. The Webb family had worked those rolling hills for nearly 70 years. When Daniel took over at 34, the property stretched across 120 acres. Looking at it from the road, it seemed like a dream. Rows of corn shimmered in the summer heat. Cattle grazed the hillside pastures. A white farmhouse overlooked the valley, where Claire, Daniel's wife, kept a kitchen garden bursting with tomatoes, beans, squash, and herbs. To anyone driving past, it looked like success. It wasn't. People often think a larger farm automatically makes more money. Daniel learned the opposite. Every extra acre demanded something. More fencing, more diesel, more fertilizer, more repairs, more time. The larger tractor burned fuel even while idling. The combine needed expensive maintenance every season. The cattle had to be rotated across multiple pastures, each requiring gates, water lines, and constant attention. By harvest, Daniel had usually worked 14-hour days for weeks without a break. He'd collapse into bed too tired to eat, then wake before sunrise to do it again. Every January, he'd spread receipts across the kitchen table while Claire quietly added numbers into an old ledger. Revenue looked impressive. Expenses looked even bigger. When everything was finally subtracted, the profit was so thin it barely justified another year. One winter evening, Claire closed the ledger and looked across the table. "We're working harder every year," Daniel nodded. "But we're not getting ahead." No one outside that kitchen knew it. From the road, the farm still looked perfect. But Daniel had begun to suspect something uncomfortable. Maybe the farm wasn't growing. Maybe the bills were. Still, he kept going. Because that's what farmers do. Until the rain came. It started quietly, just another spring storm. The first day brought steady rain. The second filled the ditches. By the fourth day, the creek had swallowed its banks. Daniel wasn't worried yet. The creek had flooded before. His grandfather used to call it the Moody One. It makes a lot of noise before it does any real damage. But this time was different. The rain never stopped. By the 7th day, water reached the fence posts. By the 9th, the pasture disappeared. On the 11th morning, Daniel stepped onto the porch before sunrise. He stood perfectly still. The fields he'd planted only weeks earlier were gone. Not damaged, gone. Where neat rows of young crops had stretched across 40 acres, there was only muddy brown water moving silently toward the road. The equipment barn had taken almost 2 feet of floodwater. Fence lines had vanished. Freshly planted seed had been carried downstream. The cattle survived. Animals often sense danger before people do. They had already gathered on the highest hill long before daylight. Daniel watched them standing together against the gray sky. Safe. Everything else wasn't. For days, he barely spoke. He shoveled mud, dragged soaked equipment into the sun, pulled broken lumber from what used to be fence lines. Every evening, he returned to the kitchen table with another estimate. Another repair, another invoice, another number. The total climbed higher every night. Insurance covered some. Government assistance covered a little more. Neither came close. By September, Daniel understood something he had spent months trying not to admit. The farm could survive, but only if something else didn't. He had 2 choices: borrow enough money that one bad season would destroy everything, or sell land that had carried his family's name for generations. He chose the second. The paperwork only took 45 minutes. Walking away took much longer. A week before the new owner took possession, Daniel walked the boundary one last time. He stopped beneath an old white oak where his father had taught him to mend fences. The initials his grandfather carved into the bark as a young man were still there. Weathered, but visible. Daniel rested one hand against the trunk. He didn't cry. He simply stood there, long enough to remember. When he drove home from the closing, he felt like a man who had just handed someone else his father's name. He believed he had lost 80 acres. He didn't realize he had just been given a second chance. Daniel expected the remaining 40 acres to keep the family afloat. Barely, nothing more. He walked every inch of it during the winter. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at the land as 120 acres. He was looking at 40, and something strange happened. He began noticing things he'd never had time to see before. The rocky hillside where corn had always struggled didn't actually want corn. The creek banks weren't failures. They were trying to become something else. Even Claire looked at the smaller property differently. One afternoon, standing beside the little kitchen garden she'd cared for years, she smiled and said, "What if we stop asking this land to be something it isn't?" It was such a simple question, yet neither of them had ever asked it before. By the time spring arrived, the farm would look nothing like it had the year before, and the biggest surprise hadn't happened yet. The first thing Daniel sold was the big tractor. For years, that machine had been the pride of the farm. It could cover dozens of acres in a day. It could also empty a bank account almost as quickly. When the buyer drove it down the gravel lane for the last time, Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets and watched until it disappeared around the bend. He expected to feel embarrassed. Instead, he felt lighter. The monthly payment disappeared. The fuel bill shrank. The repair costs that had haunted every planting season vanished with it. Without realizing it, Daniel had spent years building a farm that existed to justify the equipment, instead of the other way around. Now the equipment had to justify the farm, and most of it couldn't. Over the next few months, the changes came one after another. The rocky northeast hillside became an orchard, not because orchards were fashionable, because fruit trees actually wanted the slope: apple, pear, peach. A handful of pawpaw trees tucked into the highest corner of the property. The creek corridor, where flooding had once destroyed crops, became permanent pasture. Instead of fighting the water every spring, Daniel decided to work with it. He planted native grasses whose roots reached deep into the soil. The creek banks slowly stopped collapsing. Wildflowers appeared where muddy erosion had once carved ugly scars through the fields. Claire's kitchen garden changed too. What had once been a hobby beside the farmhouse became 28 carefully planned growing beds. Lettuce, carrots, tomatoes, peppers, beans, herbs. Instead of selling through wholesalers, Claire drove 20 minutes every Saturday morning to the farmer's market. Then something unexpected happened. One local restaurant asked if she could supply vegetables every week. Then another. By midsummer, 3 restaurants were calling before harvest day, asking what would be available. The little garden beside the house had quietly become one of the farm's most dependable sources of income. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't chasing the farm. The farm was beginning to carry itself, or so he thought, because nature wasn't finished testing him. The orchard looked beautiful that April. Thousands of blossoms covered the young trees, white, pink, soft against the green Tennessee hills. Daniel walked through them almost every evening. He had already started imagining harvest: boxes of apples, fresh pears, children picking fruit beneath trees that had once struggled to grow corn. Then, late one night, the temperature dropped. Hard. By sunrise, the blossoms hung limp beneath a coat of ice. 2 days later, they turned brown. Nearly 80% of the year's fruit was gone. Daniel didn't say much that week. He walked through the orchard every morning, stopping beneath one tree after another, looking upward, as if willing the blossoms to come back. One evening, Claire found him sitting on an overturned bucket near the creek. "You thinking about the old farm?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "For a minute, I thought maybe everyone was right." Claire smiled gently. "Maybe, but if we'd still had 120 acres, we'd have lost those blossoms too, and we'd still have the tractor payment." Daniel laughed. Not because anything was funny, because she was right. The setback hurt, but it didn't threaten the farm. Years earlier, one failed crop might have pushed them deeper into debt. Now, it was simply one difficult season inside a healthier system. That was the difference. The farm no longer depended on one thing succeeding. It had learned how to survive, and so had Daniel. By the winter of 2014, Daniel and Claire returned to the same kitchen table where they had once calculated flood damage and wondered whether they would lose everything. Only this time, the conversation was different. Claire opened the ledger. Daniel sharpened a pencil. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The only sound in the room was paper turning. Finally, Claire looked up. "I think you should check these." Daniel did. Then he checked them again. Revenue was lower than it had been when they farmed 120 acres. That part wasn't surprising. But expenses had fallen even faster. No oversized equipment loans. No massive fertilizer contracts. Far less diesel. Fewer repairs. Less wasted time driving from one end of the property to the other. When the final numbers were added together, the net income was 43% higher than the average of the old farm. 43% on 1/3 of the land. Daniel called his younger brother, who worked as an accountant in Knoxville. "Tell me I made a mistake." His brother laughed. "I've checked it twice." "You didn't." For a long time, Daniel simply stared out the kitchen window. Snow had started falling across the orchard. The creek moved quietly beyond it. Nothing about the farm looked extraordinary. No giant machines. No endless fields. No impressive acreage. Just 40 acres doing exactly what they were meant to do. That's when Daniel finally understood something the flood had been trying to teach him all along. The goal had never been to farm more land. The goal had been to build a better farm. Word spread slowly. A neighbor stopped by one afternoon asking about the orchard. Another wanted to see the rotational grazing paddocks. Someone else came to ask how Claire kept selling out at the farmer's market. Visitors expected to find a secret, a special crop, a hidden technique. Daniel always disappointed them. He would smile, lean against the old fence beside the orchard, and ask them one question. "Which part of your farm makes the least money, and why are you working so hard to keep it?" Most people didn't answer, because they had never thought about it. Neither had Daniel, not until the flood forced him to. Years later, he admitted something that surprised almost everyone. "If that flood had never happened, I'd probably still be farming 120 acres. I'd still be working 14-hour days. And I'd still think being busy meant I was succeeding." He paused before adding, "But busy and profitable aren't the same thing." There are people who still drive past Daniel Webb's farm and wonder why it looks so small. They see fewer fields, fewer cattle, less machinery. What they don't see is a family eating dinner together before sunset. A husband and wife no longer wondering if next season will be their last. An orchard growing stronger every year. A creek that's no longer treated like an enemy. Or a farm that finally became profitable because it stopped trying to become bigger. Daniel Webb didn't save his farm by expanding it. He saved it by understanding it. Sometimes the hardest lesson the land can teach is that success isn't measured by how much you own. It's measured by how well you care for what remains. Farmer's Ledger, more stories from the land.